Rachel Richter is an urban wildlife biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife in DFW. She has a bachelor's degree in wildlife and fisheries science from Texas A&M and a master's degree in wildlife ecology from Texas State. As an urban wildlife biologist, she focuses on making our communities more wildlife friendly through educational outreach and providing technical guidance. So without further ado, let's welcome Rachel.
Great, thank you, Joy. Should I just let you know when to advance to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in today to learn some more about the best management practices for dealing with some birds that can sometimes be a little bit tricky here in North Texas. So up first, we're going to talk about nuisance rookeries, and go ahead and go to the next slide, please. This is an issue that I think people are getting more familiar with, but if it's something you've never dealt with before, it can be a real shock the first time you encounter this. So a rookery is a group of, in this case, nesting or roosting water birds of various species that we'll talk about which species in a second. And this can vary in size from just a few nesting pairs to hundreds or thousands of birds. They generally prefer large, mature trees that have dense canopy cover. And these birds have site fidelity, which means that they tend to return to the same location year after year. So if the birds are nesting there one year, it's likely that they're going to come back. And also because they return to the same location every year, like the birds, the babies who were born there tend to return to their to where they were born to nest. It's possible to see like a huge an increase in the size of the rookery over the lifespan of the rookery. So sometimes when we're talking with people who are having an issue with these birds, it's not uncommon to hear like, oh, well, we've always had a few birds nesting in this area, but it was never a big problem. And now this year we have 500 of them. What's going on? Next slide, please. So the nesting season for a rookery is fairly long. So it can begin in late February, is when the first species could potentially be showing up. And the birds could be hanging around as late as October before they're all gone. They do nest in cycles. So for example, if you have different species arriving at different times. So that results in kind of like a staggered start to eggs being laid and hatching. And also if the first nest fails, often they will re-nest if it's early enough in this season. So it's not uncommon to have nests at different stages of development throughout the whole nesting period. And there's usually multiple species involved, and this evolved as a survival strategy. And the idea is basically what we call like predator swamping. So like we have all of our babies at the same time, then it makes it much less likely that the predators are going to be able to eat all of them. Because they just get overwhelmed. They can only eat so many baby birds at one time. So it increases the likelihood of survival for any given nest. Next slide, please. And this is all well and good. And, it can actually be kind of a cool thing to see unless it is in your yard. Because as you can imagine, with hundreds of birds around, it's loud, there's lots of poop, it smells, the ground gets pretty dirty from feathers. You'll have dead or injured birds on the ground. They'll also regurgitate their prey, so you might have like dead, half-eaten fish on the ground, and also just live birds hanging out on the ground. Next slide, please. So these are the species that are the most common in this type of rookery in North Texas. So we have the black-crowned night heron and the yellow-crowned night heron, and those two species are the ones that typically will arrive first. So they will typically arrive in that late February, early March timeframe. And these birds are typically not in great numbers, but they will, and so a lot of times they go unnoticed because it's usually just like a handful of nesting pairs or maybe just one nesting pair. So a lot of times people don't notice them, or they do see them and they think, hey, that's a really cool bird that is nesting in my tree, and don't think much of it. We also have great egrets, snowy egrets, little blue herons, and cattle egrets. Cattle egrets tend to be the most abundant, but they don't arrive until later in the nesting season. So you're not really going to see them in like full force until May. And that's usually when people kind of realize that they might have a problem, because you have a lot of birds. The cattle egrets can be in very large numbers. And so then you'll have a lot of birds. And the problem, but by that point, the rookery may already be established, so you're going to be limited in what you can do. Next slide, please. So these birds are protected along with most other native birds. So they are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is one of our oldest and strongest wildlife protection laws. This is actually an international convention between the US, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia. So this is not just the United States that abides by the rules of this act, it is other countries as well. And the thought behind that is, if Canada is doing a really good job to protect habitat for one species, but then they migrate south to the United States and we're shooting them, then it's going to be hard to manage the birds. So the idea here, the reason why we have multiple countries participating in this act is to protect birds that migrate to other countries so that they're protected throughout their range. So this does not just apply to egrets. Pretty much any native bird species is going to be protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And essentially what it means is it's illegal to kill or harm the birds. It is also illegal to be in possession of eggs, feathers, or nests. So you can't keep them and sell them or anything like that. And it is also illegal to do something that might cause death or abandonment of eggs or hatchlings. And violations of this act can result in fines and jail times. And then there's similar law at the state level. So they are protected by both state and federal law. Next slide, please. So if you have a situation where you have protected birds that are nesting in a really undesirable location, you kind of, the first question is, well, what can we do that is legal to encourage these birds not to come back? So in the case of a rookery, it is prohibited to kill or injure the birds or to harass them in a way that causes abandonment or death of eggs or hatchlings. However, it is legal to use scare tactics as long as there are no active nests and as long as you're not harming the adult birds. So if there are no eggs laid anywhere within that rookery, you can do things to encourage the birds to go elsewhere as long as you're not harming them. And if there's no active if there's no eggs in the nests and there's no hatchlings, then you're not at risk of causing death of eggs or hatchlings. Next slide. However, once the first bird lays an egg, in any nest in that rookery, all harassment and scare tactics have to stop. So if you think about what I said a few minutes ago, where we have the night herons who show up early in late February, early March, and people don't typically notice them. And then a couple months later, we have lots more birds that potentially could show up. One of the complications with managing nuisance rookeries is a lot of times people don't realize that they're going to have a nuisance rookery until eggs have already been laid. And once that first egg is laid, you really are more or less locked into having that rookery for the rest of the nesting season. Next slide, please. One common question people have is like, well, what can we do that's going to be considered a disturbance? So anything that is like a routine neighborhood activity can continue. So you can mow your yard, trash collection can come, the mail can be delivered. Anything that was like going on in that neighborhood prior to the establishment of the rookery is okay to continue doing, because the birds made their homes there while all that stuff was going on. So that's, you know, we don't consider that to be a substantial nuisance because they established their nests while those things were happening. Next slide, please. At the end of the nesting season, so once all of the birds have fledged, all of the hatchlings have fledged, nests can be removed, and any eggs that are no longer viable or nestlings can also be destroyed. So you can just throw them into the trash. And you do want to go in and remove those old nests, because that can be something that birds see the following year and see it as an attractant to that area. Next slide. People often want to know, isn't there some sort of permit that we can get in this situation to, you know, make the birds leave sooner? There is a permit. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offers a depredation permit, and it authorizes the lethal removal of a limited number of birds and eggs. The key word here is limited. So, for example, in a situation where you have a rookery that's in a neighborhood, they might issue a permit for probably a maximum of 10% take in that rookery. So if you have 500 birds, removing 50 of them is not really going to improve your situation. And the take under this permit is going to apply to both birds and eggs. So this permit does exist. We do generally recommend that cities apply for this permit if they've had an issue with nuisance rookeries in the past, because there are some features of it that can allow for greater flexibility when managing a rookery. But this is not you know, a magic wand that is just going to make all of the birds go away. It really only allows for a limited amount of management. Next slide. So when we are talking about managing nuisance rookeries, the key is really to focus on prevention, because again, once that first egg is laid, there's not much that you can do that would be considered legal. So it's really focused on early detection. The birds that arrive first, you know, we call them sometimes scout birds or sentry birds. Like, they're the ones who are scouting out the location. And when they first arrive, when those birds first arrive, they don't feel like they have that safety in numbers. They're not sure how they feel about the neighborhood, if it's safe or not. And so they're more nervous, and they're easier to scare away when it's just a few of them instead of it being a whole bunch of them. So it's really critical to, if you're going to do any deterrence, they need to happen before eggs are laid. It's also important to talk to the public about this issue so that they know what to look for when it comes to a rookery, because pretty much every time I've dealt with a nuisance rookery in a neighborhood, the city does not know about it until it's already too late to start doing prevention. So it's really important to, develop a plan within your community. Talk about who, if there is a nuisance rookery, which department is going to take the lead on managing that. And think about what services you're willing to offer your residents in order to help mitigate the issue. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about what some of the different deterrents are. You can use noise deterrents, so things like predator calls, firecrackers, propane cannons, anything that makes a loud booming noise is going to be scary. You can also use visual deterrents, so things like mylar tape and scare eye balloons. You want to hang those high up in the trees. A lot of times people will just go out and put it on like the branch that's easier for them to reach, but that's not where the birds are. The birds are higher up in the tree, so you want it high up. These things basically, they shine and they move, and they don't, and birds don't like it, so it kind of makes them uncomfortable. Let's see. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. You can even go as far as knocking early nesting material out of the trees, as long as there are no eggs anywhere in that rookery yet. So before you do this, you just want to be very sure that there are no eggs in the nest that you're about to knock out. One way that I've seen people do that is they'll take like a cell phone and put it in video mode and attach it to a pole, and they'll kind of look up in the nest, and then you can watch the video, and when you take it back down and see if there are eggs in there. So that's one option, and this can be a deterrent to the birds hanging around as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so the most effective way to prevent the birds from establishing establishing a rookery is to thin the tree canopies. Now, this has to be done before the birds arrive. So we generally recommend, sometime in the fall or winter, having trees trimmed. Birds prefer, the egrets will prefer a greater than 75% canopy closure. So if you can thin your trees down below that level, they don't feel the habitat is not as appealing to them. So what they like overlapping branches, because that helps them move around in the tree. So if you get rid of that, and we're not asking to cut down the trees. So if you look at this picture, the right side of the street has been trimmed and the left side has not. So you still have your tree. What we're looking for, though, is when you look up, you can see sky and sunlight can hit the ground. So you've gotten rid of most of those overlapping branches, and the birds don't feel as sheltered in these trees as they do before they're trimmed. Next slide, please. This is just another example where you can see the right side of the street has been trimmed and the left side has not. The really good thing about this is it provides much longer lasting prevention than, just going out and shooting off firecrackers. So this will last a few years, whereas those noise and sound, those sound and visual deterrences are much more temporary. Next slide, please. And generally we find there is no one single silver bullet with this. Thinning the trees is absolutely the most effective thing, but because again those birds have sight fidelity, they kind of have it hardwired in them to return to the same location. So the combination of modifying the habitat, thinning the trees, and then also doing those sound and sight deterrents is what we find to be the most effective. So you're going to want to start toward the end of February and carry those on through June. And we find that to be the most effective. Next slide, please. So in summary, again, early detection is really the key, because once an egg has been laid, all harassment techniques must stop. And I am sorry to say that this is usually not a one-time fix. Most communities that deal with this issue will have to deal with it a couple years in a row before the birds really kind of get the hint that this neighborhood has gone downhill and it's not as attractive to them as it used to be. So I really encourage you, if you work for a city and you're listening to this call, talk about this issue with your colleagues and try and have some sort of a plan, because just having familiarity with the issue and having a plan of what to tell residents and what sort of services you are able to provide to them really can help get you through that first year when it can be difficult to manage this situation. Next slide, please. And then next slide, I'll just go ahead and go on into the next presentation, then take questions at the end if I have time. So next up, we're going to talk about the downside of feeding ducks. I know that this is something that all of us has probably done. I did it when I was a kid. But there's a lot of bad things that can happen as a result of the good intentions behind feeding ducks. Next slide, please. So typically when people are feeding ducks, what do we see them feeding? A lot of times people are tossing out bread, right? Like that's the staple duck food that people go to parks and gives. Also, kind of junky food like chips, popcorn, crackers, cat food I've seen. So these are all things that are not part of a duck's natural diet. Next slide, please. And what a duck should be eating is primarily going to be aquatic plants, aquatic invertebrates, and other kind of small things that are living in the pond. Next slide. And so when we're feeding them, the stuff that we typically feed ducks is not healthy for the ducks, and they don't get adequate nutrition. Just like if you and I were to eat Doritos all day, every day, we would probably have some health consequences associated with that if we didn't at least occasionally eat a salad. Feeding ducks human food all day, every day is bad for their health. So these ducks that you see in this picture, they have a condition known as angel wing, which is where they don't, as a result of malnutrition, their last joint in their wrist rotates out. So the way that their wings are out like that, their wings are permanently stuck like that. They can't move their wings the right way anymore. Next slide. Feeding ducks also encourages them to their population to be more dense than it would be naturally. And whenever we have animals that are in a close proximity, that are in like a high density in a specific area, that increases the likelihood for disease spread. With ducks, one of the big ones that we look out for is duck viral enteritis, which is one that can make its way through a population pretty fast and has a very high mortality rate. Avian influenza is another one to watch out for right now. And if these animals are close together, then it's more likely that that disease will spread quickly through their population. Next slide. Also, when we feed ducks, we are increasing the likelihood that they're going to become habituated, that they're going to lose their fear of people, and that they're going to hang out where people are hanging out. So this every year I get calls about ducks. They're not always the smartest with where they choose to make their nest. So every year I get calls about ducks that are nesting in an inappropriate place, or about ducks that have taken over swimming pools. I've dealt with communities who had to have their community pool shut down because it was too filled with duck poop to be safe to open. And when we have them, when we encourage them to nest near us, there's more likelihood for conflict. So, everyone has probably been to a park and encountered a goose that wasn't particularly friendly. Usually geese are only, usually geese, they're not always aggressive, but they tend to be more aggressive if they have a nest nearby. And when they get the idea that it's good to be around people and then they nest, it's more likely that you're going to have geese, guarding the entrance to a building and being aggressive toward people. Next slide, please. Also, a lot of the ducks that we have in our city parks and urban areas are species that are not actually native to Texas. These are invasive species. These are ducks that are often feral, so they were domestic duck species that people released and then they have since become wild. So a lot of these species don't really belong here anyway, so they're not they don't really have a natural role to play in the ecosystem. Next slide. And these are just some examples of our native duck species that we have in the area. We have lots of duck species that are here year-round, and then we're also being part of the Central Flyway. We have a lot of migratory species that are cool to see that pass through north central Texas. Next slide. Also, when you're feeding ducks, not all of that food is going to be eaten by the ducks. A lot of it will be left on the ground or in the water and stuff like that. And so that can attract other wildlife species that we don't want getting used to getting food from people either. So things like rodents, raccoons, bobcats, coyotes. I worked with one city one time that they were having an issue with coyotes being a little bit too bold with people at a city park. And they realized that when people were feeding the ducks, they were also tossing some bread to the coyotes, because the coyotes would kind of come up expectantly to people who were feeding the ducks. Next slide. And also, when we have too many ducks in an area, they can trample down the vegetation. So you see this pond, there is no grass left, right? It's just bare dirt. And of course, that's going to have an impact on water quality, because plants are so important for filtering out pollutants and stabilizing soil. And so this is going to cause a runoff of sediment and other contaminants into the water and lead to erosion as well. Next slide. And water quality is a huge issue when we talk about feeding ducks and having having too many ducks at a pond, an overpopulation of ducks. So ducks and geese, they poop a lot, and all of those nutrients are going to go into the water. When you have too many nutrients in an area, it can lead to eutrophication, which causes algal blooms and fish kills. Also, again, the ducks probably are not going to eat all of the food that is given to them. Some parks, if you sit and watch, it's just like a constant stream of people coming to feed them. So a lot of that food is just going to get left in the water, and can clog up infrastructure and rot and other issues. Next slide. So what are the management options? So it can be kind of challenging to manage duck feeding, because generally people are really doing it out of kindness that they're feeding these ducks, and they don't realize that they don't realize the harm that they could potentially be causing by feeding the ducks. So outreach and education is going to be key. Here's some examples of some different signs that you could put up. Just asking people, please don't feed the ducks, and here's why. It's bad for the ducks, it's bad for the environment. I also think that having a feeding ordinance is a really good idea. I think every city should have a feeding ordinance, a wildlife feeding ordinance on the books. So not just specific to ducks, but to all wildlife. Even if, I know in most cases a feeding ordinance, it's not realistic to be enforcing it all the time. But it gives you the option of, if you ever really do have an issue with people feeding wildlife to the point where it is becoming a serious nuisance. Like if you've got someone who is feeding bobcats barbecue every day, and those bobcats are getting way too bold with people, you can then back up, you can tell them to stop and then say, and if you don't, we have this feeding ordinance, which means you'll be fined this amount or whatever. There is nothing at the state or federal level that prevents feeding of wildlife. So it's really up to each individual city to decide how they want to manage that. Next slide, please. A lot of times people will ask, okay, but what if we're not feeding them junk food? What if we're feeding them healthy food instead? And there's lots of kind of fancy looking infographics on social media, like this one that talk about like, oh, don't feed them bread, instead feed them healthy food. Next slide. But Texas Parks and Wildlife generally recommends not feeding wildlife at all, not feeding ducks at all, because even if you're feeding them stuff that might be slightly more nutritious, they're still not going to be able to get all of the nutrients that they would get from a natural diet. And it's still not going to prevent those issues like overpopulation and disease spread and the impacts to water quality and the habitat degradation. Next slide. If you are dealing primarily with ducks that are not native, you have options on how you have options to remove them, because there are no state or federal regulations to protect them because they are not native species. So these birds that are not native are not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that I was mentioning in my last presentation. Excuse me. So you can do things with non-native waterfowl. You can do things like oil or addle their eggs. This basically makes their eggs non-viable. The downside to this, if you do this, just know that you're not going to see an immediate decrease in the population. You're basically just going to maintain the population at the current level and slow reproduction, but it's not going to immediately address the issues if you have serious negative side effects of too many ducks. You also have the option to trap and remove non-native waterfowl. And that will be the quickest way to stop the damage that is being done to the water body. Next slide. And, if people, I think it's good, when you tell people, no, you can't do this, give them something else that they can do. Give them other ways that they can get out there and enjoy nature. So it's not just, hey, you can't do this anymore, because that might be the way that they think that they can, that might be the way that they get out and enjoy their park. So what you want to do, so I recommend, giving people alternatives. It's like, no, you can't feed the ducks, but there's still lots of really cool things that you can do to appreciate the ducks. So, bird watching, go out and look for ducks and other bird species at the park. You can contribute to citizen science projects like iNaturalist and eBird. You can do photography, and you can also do things to improve your local park. Next slide, please. The focus really should be on promoting healthy habitats that support waterfowl, that support ducks and geese, and lots of other species as well, and promote good water quality too. And I think that's next slide, and I think that's the end of my slides. And I don't think that I have time for questions. We probably need to let Adam start his, but I can take questions if I'll let Joy decide.
If it's okay with everyone, just because of some of the technical issues we were having, could we just hold the questions until the end, unless there's anything that's like super imperative that you'd like to like ask right now? But if not, we will go ahead into Adams. And thank you so much, Rachel, for that awesome and informative presentation. And now we will go into Adam Henry's bio. So Adam Henry is an assistant director supervisor for the Fort Worth district of the Texas Wildlife Services program. Adam has spent 13 years conducting educational programs, technical assistance, and direct control to resolve human wildlife conflicts in the DFW Metroplex area. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause, virtual round of applause, to welcome Adam and his presentation.
Well, thank you. All right, let's roll to the next slide. We'll try to talk a little faster since we need to make up some time. So thank y'all for having me. Again, Adam Henry, Assistant District Supervisor for the Fort Worth District. We are 61 counties small in our district, so we have a little bit of time to cover, or at least some ground to cover when we get out and get to working. So next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk about the resident Canada goose and a little bit of black vultures real quick, just to hit some high notes on black vulture programs that we have. Next slide. So if you don't know who we are, obviously the Texas Wildlife Services program is well over 100 years at this point. We are a collaborative agency between USDA, APHIS Wildlife Services, with the federal side of the house, and then the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension program. And our third entity is the Texas Wildlife Damage Management Association. Next slide. We have spent those 100+ years working on health and human safety, working around facilities and helping prevent wildlife damage to infrastructure, crops, if we're talking feral hog issues and to farmers. Even in the Metroplex, we have a healthy urban hog program. We deal with coyotes, dealing with livestock as far as predatory animals, and we also help protect endangered species, sea turtles down on the Gulf Coast from predatory animals, coyotes and hogs and raccoons and things like that. So we dabble in a lot of wildlife intervention and human and wildlife intervention as well. Next slide. So everybody knows this guy. This is our quintessential turkey vulture that we have for hundreds and hundreds of years and eons, rolling around, doing the fun things, cleaning up Mother Nature's trash compactor. They're picking up dead animals on the highways and byways of Texas and having a good time to do it. Very easy to spot a turkey vulture. Really nice big red head and long big wings, big bodied bird. If we notice, our primary flight feathers have that good silver color running perpendicular to the body. Next slide. And it is a drastic contrast from what a black-headed vulture looks like. So our silver, first picture we look at, that silver color on those primary flight feathers is just out on the very tip of the feathers, and a shorter overall bird, smaller, more compact, slightly a little bit more food aggressive than the turkey vulture. In fact, they like to congregate around turkey vultures and take their meal from them. Next slide. So we tend to see in agriculture-based situations that the black vulture causes the most problems. They are the most predatory of the two. They are both protected under Migratory Bird Treaty Act and also Chapter 64 of the state code. There are depredation permits available, and just as we were talking about other birds underneath that status, if we are only using non-lethal harassment, we do not need a permit outside of nesting season. Next slide. So we see them attacking livestock. We see them around buildings. This is typically what we get a lot of complaints about as far as structure damage, where we have them around houses. We've had them out of banks, and they were actually coming off of the top of the bank and jumping down on the staff cars and pulling the rubber windshield wiper blades apart, the caulking on your windows and around houses, the shingles, as it's seen here in this picture on the Fairfield Inn. They're actually bored and they're pulling the shingles. Next slide. We get wintertime rookeries from about October to February is where we tend to see the biggest congregation of birds. And if you notice, there's a beautiful turkey vulture sitting there with his wings spread out. And so we have black vultures and turkey vultures commingling in some of this, but not in the greater numbers. We see less turkey vultures in a group like this, but they do commingle. Next slide. And this is indicative of what we see with our what we call our wintertime calving season. That January through February is where we really see the most calls and have the most interaction with landowners when they're calving, and where black vultures are actually attacking the calves or the cow if they get down in distress during calving. Next slide. So some of our non-lethal harassment efforts, Rachel did a great job talking about them. They're going to be the same here. That the bird bangers, the screamers, lasers tend to work a little bit, and effigies. And this is a picture of what we describe as a black vulture effigy. We're going to turn that bird upside down or use a likeness of that bird and hang it in a distressed form and get it up where those birds can see it in conjunction with our harassment tools. Next slide. Places to find those supplies. Reed Joseph, Margot Supply are two great suppliers of our bird bangers, the screamers. They have the launchers, which are the little pistols. Obviously, safety glasses and ear protection are always paramount when we're using any kind of tool like that. Next slide. And this is kind of a picture of one of our airport biologists using a pyrotechnic gun. At an airport, this is where we traditionally think of bird harassment as airports, but we can certainly use it all over in different areas. One of the things I want to add that we're talking about with egrets, making sure that if we're a citizen using this in our inside city limits, making sure we have permission. Most of our cities have some kind of ordinance against fireworks and the discharge of firearms. So this is kind of putting both of those together. Let's make sure we have some permissions before we just jump out and start guns a-blazing going and harassing birds with non-lethal tools and potentially getting a foul with the city officials. Next slide. And a very good tool, again, propane cannons are another tool. They can be very effective with black vultures. We see them in conjunction with the pyrotechnics. This sits on the ground and can even be mounted in the back of a truck, so it can be mobile. But the handheld pyrotechnic really does kind of bridge the gap because it's actually a device coming to the animal. Whenever we launch it, it's actually going to the animal. So it just kind of adds to this propane cannon. I see a lot of folks setting these up, turning them on, and forgetting about them. And as you can see in this picture, they turn into a bird roost. That's bird poop on the solar panel and all that, where the birds aren't really scared of it anymore. So we need to make these scare tools and tactics very effective and keep them moving so that the birds don't get accustomed to them. Next slide. So as we talked about, there are two permit options now, and that's why I bring this up and we talk about it more. Your standard migratory depredation permit, that is going to be a permit when we actually need to try to remove potentially more birds than our 5-bird permit that we'll talk about here briefly. You are going to go through U.S. Fish and Wildlife for that. As with all of our depredation permits, Wildlife Services does offer that complimentary document. It's called a WS Form 37. So when you get that depredation permit packet, it's going to ask that you have talked to a Wildlife Services biologist or employee to get a WS Form 37. That accompaniment document goes with your application, and that just kind of checks and balances, says that yes, we do believe that you need a permit for what you're trying to do. That permit, when you go through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Direct, that actually costs $100 for the landowner. It is free for governmental entities, but a property owner does have to pay out of pocket for that. Now, our Texas Wildlife Damage Management Association permit is something that we've put together in collaboration with the Albuquerque office to offer a free permit to sub-permittees. So let's say you've got 10, 15, 20 head of cattle, and you've got vultures that show up during calving season. This allows you to have a permit and give you 5 birds for lethal take to be used in conjunction with your non-lethal harassment as effigies. So this will give you a live bird effigy. Again, if you're inside of city limits or in restricted areas where you're going to have to figure out a way to actually make that permit work if you can't discharge a firearm, because you're going to need to be able to kill a live bird to use it as an effigy. But it is in conjunction with your non-lethal effort. And so that is a program we've had out for several years. Certainly at the end of the program, my phone number should be on the last slide. Happy to call, emails and everything like that if it is applicable. We're always willing to help try to get that permit or get some assistance if something else won't work. So next slide. So, all right, we're going to run right into our resident Canada goose. It is prime time molt season for geese. I actually had a goose roundup scheduled for tonight, but it has gotten canceled. And so this is our prime time for goose. Next slide. So our average goose, somewhere between that 5 to 14 pounds. Most of our adults in the Metroplex are running about a 10-pound average. They are 3 years old. Once they become sexually mature, it's that 3rd year that they would mate and be able to have first clutch. They do mate for life and pair up together. March and April is our traditional nesting season. Depending on year, we kind of move up and down. We see nests as early as mid-February sometimes. 2 to 9 eggs per nest, usually that 5 to 6. Nature likes even numbers, so very common to see that 6 egg clutch. And 28-day incubation time. They molt in June, usually June and July, so it lasts for about 20 to 40 days on that molt. It kind of coincides with the young of the year putting on their adult feathers and their primary flight feathers, and then everybody being able to fly off together with mom and dad. So, like I said, we are prime time molt. About June the 15th is when I start scheduling for roundups that we'll talk about. Next slide. So we see these birds potentially do what we call a molt migration. So we talk about the adults having eggs at 3 years old, but we have that 2-year span where we've got subadults that potentially are here in town, and then we start seeing them go to places just before they start to molt, and we call that a molt migration. So birds that were there in February, March may not be there if they didn't have eggs. They may not be there come June or July because they may go somewhere else down the road to have that molt. What we have to remember, as Rachel alluded to, geese leave about 3 pounds of fecal matter a day per goose. So now we start having those birds on a piece of property because they're flightless during that molt time. They're leaving that 3 pounds of fecal matter a day in a waterway. Most of the time we see them at golf courses and they start impacting the grass. I really think a goose can destroy more golf course than a feral swine can. We just see it bigger, but geese on top of that golf structure and those greens every day, eating and pucking at at the grass definitely causes some major damage. We have some serious disease concerns when we confine a lot of birds together, and a lot. Last year we removed about 700 birds throughout the metroplex and various areas, and so that's a lot. When we have 50 to 60 birds in one spot, especially on a small area, it starts to add up. 60 birds times 3 pounds a day starts adding up real quick. Right now in the news, we have a lot of conversation about the high path AI that we're seeing in our dairies, at our feed barns and feed lots. And so we know geese carry high path AI. It has already been sampled. We have confirmed that they carry it. So on top of that, all of the other fun things, Salmonella, E. coli, potentially Giardia, bringing that into waterways with them, and a lot of those potentially zoonotic diseases that we're trying to keep track of. Next slide. So when we start talking about non-lethal harassment with geese, and other waterfowl, we're talking lights, the yellow blinky lights. I've got some pictures in here that we can look at in a minute. We've seen some good luck with coyote decoys, had some golf courses that pick up and move little coyote decoys. Pyrotechnics can work. Again, most of our urban geese are inside of a city, and so we have to kind of use that wisely. Dogs, we've got several private companies out there using collie dogs and Australian Shepherd dogs, those herding type breeds, to chase and harass geese on the ground. Flagging can work. Again, it's all about causing distraction. The best one we've really seen is the lights. There you go. Oh, there you go. Go back to that. There you go. Perfect. Lights. That was perfect cue in. These guys can be bought. This one on the left is a floating light, has that blinking yellow hazard light that we all see on our traffic cones and things on the highways, but we can incorporate that along the shoreline of any of our water features and put 2 or 3 of them out in a pond, and it helps kind of disrupt their sleep patterns. The birds don't really like it a whole lot, and it helps keep them from staying and loafing in that water area. Next slide. So, like I said, we've seen this light. It's a very common light. The one little guy on the left there is probably a $20 or $30 light. It can be purchased very cheap. You can make your own little stand out of PVC pipe, as we see here on the right. I've even had folks go out into the water feature and float them on a piece of styrofoam and just anchor them out and let them blink for a while, making sure that we kind of maintain them and work with them. But it doesn't have to cost a lot to have good success on deterring birds from these geese from roosting there. Next slide. So our options for control, when we're talking about geese, they are migratory birds. So the permitting, if you're going to do it on your own, there are steps through that Migratory Bird Treaty Act permitting, depredation permit, that you would need to go through U.S. Fish and Wildlife. If we're going to do some egg oiling, I really encourage this, especially nesting season. It can be done kind of, I wouldn't say obscurely, but it can be done early in the morning as your lawn service is out and mowing the grass. Somebody can come along and oil those eggs, but you do have to register that flock with U.S. Fish and Wildlife on their website. There is reporting, but it's a permitless registration. So they give you a number or some kind of information back and forth with email, and then you're allowed to go oil the eggs. They do want to know how many nests you oiled and addled over that season. And so there is some reporting that has to be done after that process is done. But we're going to oil those eggs. Once we have that female that has laid eggs, we're going to make sure we come back. So we oil them once and make sure we take a count of all the eggs in the nest, so we kind of have an idea how many should be there in case she wants to add more. And after the first oiling, we're going to come back about 2 weeks later, and we're going to reapply that oil. 100% vegetable oil. It can be diluted in a spray bottle, and you can spritz it on. You can just pour it on. I've seen some folks do some paint brushing where they just slather it all on, but it shouldn't take a whole lot. We just want complete coverage of that egg. The oil stops once the egg is laid. It takes about 8 to 10 days for the embryo to actually start breathing air. And so what we do is essentially suffocate that egg from producing a chick, and come back a second time and reapply, just so we make sure we get a good coating. Again, depredation permit application. Potentially, there is some trapping and relocating with that. Again, we've got geese that potentially fly thousands of miles. If they were truly migratory, they would be flying thousands of miles. So the bare minimum for relocation is 200 miles. When we look at the literature, that's a long way to cart some geese. We have to have landowner permission. We don't just get to take them to a state park or something like that. Even a state park doesn't want a whole bunch of geese showing up there at the state park unannounced. They have to know about it. And so I don't usually recommend the relocate. Again, they're going to want to rehome and come back. We've got planes in the Metroplex. That is our biggest issue, is having bird strikes in the Metroplex with all of our airports. And so aircraft safety is very important to us on our side of the line. And so typically when we do a goose roundup, and the molt here, it does have a lethal solution on the back end of it. And so we're going to remove those birds and do it humanely and get them off the landscape so that we can kind of manage that population. Next slide. Invariably, we have some birds that are still flighted or that they have molted early and they didn't all line up with everybody. So when we do a goose roundup, this is indicative of what it looks like. We've got a drive net that we push birds into. As you can see, we've got lots of technology going on here. We've got actually 2 drones, because we've got a drone down close to the birds and we've got a drone up in the air taking the pictures. So lots and lots of technology pushing these birds into a drive net. And once we get them in the net, we can load them up in a trailer. Next slide. And then we can take them to final destination and do what we need to do to administer humane euthanasia. Or if we're going to take them and relocate them, they could be driven down the road and go wherever they need to go. So that's a big one with the geese. We do offer that service. It's something that we've done for a few years now. Again, we hold a depredation permit throughout the state for that. And so, again, it's a fast way to get a large population under control quick so that the egg oiling can actually have some effect. This research on egg oiling takes about 5 years before you start to see a decrease in the population by attrition. And so that's a lot of time, especially when we've got, say 75, 80 geese on a small piece of property. That's a lot of time to be kind of holding those birds on here. Several of our college campuses, we removed over 300 birds from a college campus in the past. And so, some of our golf courses are up almost 200 geese. That's a lot of birds to hold, waiting for 5 years to take effect on those nests and just having that population drop. And so this is a quick solution. And it's you don't ever remove them all. You're going to have more geese. This is just a faster way to get to a manageable solution. And then we turn it back over to those landowners and those cooperators, and then they maintain the egg oiling and all of that paperwork. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what we kind of do with geese. Next slide should be about our last right in there. See, I told you I could be really, really quick. We need to make up some ground on that, huh? So, like I said, happy to help anybody out if they have any questions. And hopefully Rachel will hop back on and we can get some questions on any of our topics we talked about today.
Hey, awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. And that was a lovely presentation as well. So we will go into our roundtable of questions. Okay. So we do have some questions that are up here, and also anything that is in the chat is also fair game as well. And so if there are any pertinent questions that are in the chat or anyone has, you are welcome to ask them now, or we can just go straight into the roundtable. Okay. I think we're voting for the roundtable. So we'll get into these questions for Rachel and Adam. So the first one is, what is one aspect of avian management that is challenging to convey in educational forums like this one?
I think one of the difficult things that is um, hard to convey in like a webinar like this is the human dimensions side of things. Um, some of the things that we've talked about today can be very emotional for people on both the um, people can feel very passionately and very strongly about wanting the birds to go away. They can also feel very passionately and very strongly about wanting the birds to stay. And so just being aware of that, if you think that you have um, a bird population in your community that needs to be managed for whatever reason, just know going in that it can be a hot button issue for some people.
Absolutely. That's the biggest one is making sure we understand there has to be management. In management, there has to be consumption of that resource. Sometimes that means we have to do the right thing for the animal. And it's not always good just because we're feeding the animals doesn't mean we're actually helping the animals. So
That's really awesome. And a great point to bring up because it really humanizes the topic in a way. Next question is, what is something you wish more people were aware of when it came to avian management education?
I think Adam just said it. Just because we are feeding the animals does not mean we are helping the animals. And honestly, that is true for all wildlife. Though I like to tell people the only wildlife feeding you're allowed to do is a bird feeder in your yard. And even that comes with some, things that you have to manage, which I won't get into. But so you can feed, you can have a bird feeder in your yard, but other than that, don't feed the wildlife. So that's the most important thing. I wish people know that feeding is not necessarily helping, even though those ducks may look at you with such big, sad eyes. Feeding them will not help them in the long run. And then also, um, I wish people knew more what to look for rookeries and how to manage them. So that way we could have, instead of it being a situation, June is, end of May and June, I think, is when Adam and I start to be getting calls about new nuisance rookeries that have popped up in DFW. We like to say there's probably around 5 each year. That bounce around somewhere, and it would be great if by June, though, by the time we're getting the calls, it's already too late to try and encourage the birds to move on. So I wish that people knew more about how to prevent the establishment of a rookery and how to encourage the birds to nest somewhere that will be better for them in the long run too.
that's it.
Awesome. Okay, so for our next question, what are some key takeaways that you would impart upon viewers and attendees of this forum that they can implement in their day-to-day as well as to educate others?
Trim your trees, trim your trees, right? So on the egret side, making sure we're trimming trees. On the wildlife side, just general feeding, making sure that we are ambassadors and we talk to people about not feeding animals that don't need to be fed, especially wildlife. Not all of it needs to be fed. In fact, none of it needs to be fed, as Rachel was saying. I think those are the two big ones. We all have to be ambassadors for our community. This is something that is community wide. I know we talk about specific landowners having problems, especially egret rookeries tend to happen on private property, but it affects the whole entire community. Overpopulation of domestic birds in a city pond affects the whole community. Overpopulation of Canada geese on a potential private area still affects the community because we have potential diseases that are coming with these animals. And it's not their fault. It's just the way Mother Nature is. We all had to, wash our hands and distance because we had our own zoonotic diseases that were being pushed through the community. And so we all have to do our part. That's a big one. Let's trim our trees and not feed wildlife.
I touched on this kind of briefly in my talk, but I also think, I just want to reiterate the importance of having a wildlife feeding ordinance. It would be wonderful if every city had one of those on the books. I get calls a lot of times, and I'm sure Adam probably does too, but people have an issue where they know someone is feeding wildlife and it's causing significant problems for the community because people are actively feeding the animals. And they come to Texas Parks and Wildlife thinking that we have some sort of, you're the state, surely you can stop this, but there is no statewide regulation. That's something that's left up to the individual communities to decide. So, if you work for a city and you're on this call, look into whether or not your community has one. Again, it's probably not something that's going to be enforced on like a daily basis, but if you run into a real problem, it can really come in handy to have something to back you up other than please stop. So I consider, I would look into that.
Okay. And so the other two questions are kind of like, I guess like to engage the whole entire group as well. But I did want to ask like one more follow-up question specifically to Adam and Rachel. And if there are any questions that are specified towards them in the chat, please let me know so I can also get those over. But what is something that it brings you the most joy about doing this work, and what is something that kind of like is the highlight of your day whenever you get to like talk about it or anything of that nature?
So what probably brings me the most joy is getting to contribute to making improving habitats for wildlife. So, working with property managers to make their properties better for wildlife and more suitable for wildlife, and also giving people more chances to get out and experience nature. Yeah. And I also like getting to help people if they have problems. I like being able, when I have the answer to their question.
Jump right in there. That one, every day's a new day. There's not a similar day. So every day is a new challenge, and there's always a problem to potentially get solved, or some kind of resource that we can help out with landowners or the community. A lot of these things are simple fixes, and that's the big one. It's changing habitat, or at least human nature, because a lot of it is human management. It's not really wildlife management. A lot of it is human management. And so having the answers to fix some of those problems that are very simple solutions, that just for whatever reason we don't think about, that's usually the fun part of the day. So.
Thank you. Okay, so we have two questions here. Is there anything or something that NCTCOG can provide to bolster your programs and activities? And if there is anything, please let me know. You can put it in the chat. You're also welcome to send any requests to the emails, and we'll have all of our information linked at the end of the presentation as well. So if there's anything, please let me know. But if not, I'll move on to the next question. Okay. And then what are topics you are most interested in learning more about in the upcoming and future workshops or webinars? And that is also something that if you need more time to like ruminate on that and figure that out, you're always welcome to send them to me via email. All my information will be at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay. And so again, any questions from anyone? Okay. So, and just remember at any time, if you do have any questions, you're totally welcome to ask. Just want to go over some upcoming events and meetings. We have our TMDL Coordination Committee annual meeting that will be on June 27th at 9:30 a.m. via Microsoft Teams. And we will also have our joint TMDL Stormwater Wastewater Technical Subcommittee meeting on August 14th at 9:30 a.m. via Microsoft Teams. And there is a link to our website to add those all to your calendar if you're interested in attending these meetings. What's coming up related to TMDL? We have our TMDL workshop that is the state of the Greater Trinity River Region I-Plan, and that's going to be August 6th via Microsoft Teams. And then here's all the contact information. Mine is listed at the top. And then we have Casey, which is one of my team members. And then we have Hannah, who is our supervisor, and she's also on the call with us today. And this is where you can direct any questions, me or Hannah, for TMDL related things. So thank you so much for attending our webinar. Thank you so much to Adam and Rachel for your awesome and insightful presentations. I am so thankful for the information. I learned so much today as well, and I'm sure everybody else on the call did too. So that will wrap up our webinar for today. Thank you all for coming.